I think people are starting to wake up to the fact that politics is kind of a sham, and the media is kind of a sham. You know, a lot of these ideas that we have about how our society works are delusions or half-truths. You know, the Trump election has really demonstrated that there isn't a big difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. You know, they both represent established interests, and they largely represent the same interests. We have also seen that the media are far from an independent source of news and analysis. They are a propaganda instrument of established power, right? The media are trying to manipulate people to accept the agenda of the ruling people. I wouldn't even say party, because again, that implies that there are these competing parties, but it doesn't seem to be the case. You know, a guy like Trump made a kind of outsider rogue bid for the presidency, or at least that seems to be what he is doing. But, you know, Trump had to go against the establishment of the Republican Party to do that, and appeal directly to popular support. And, you know, Trump was born into the elite himself. He isn't really a man of the people, you know, but he might identify with them, or he might just be using them as a power base to expand his own personal power. Whatever the case may be, I think people are waking up to the fact that a lot of these institutions are shams. The government doesn't actually execute the rule of law impartially. You know, in fact, we're at this absurd situation in the U.S. where people are calling Donald Trump a monster because he proposes to enforce U.S. immigration law. I mean, that just, you know, that's absurd. So the government does not act according to the law. So that turns out to be a lie. The media are not independent from politicians, from big corporations, from the government. They are acting like a propaganda instrument of established power. So I think people are starting to wake up to the underlying power structure of our societies, not just in the US, but in the entire Western world. And one of the things that is waking people up is that the establishment is acting in a way that seems to go against the interests of the majority populations. That doesn't make sense if it were a democracy. Would the government do things that the population really doesn't want to do? And not only would the government do them, but would the media then promote them and try to get everyone to agree with what the government is doing? So I think a lot of people are now looking for a different model to explain how their societies work and, you know, what is going on. Like, why is it that all of these big corporations kind of line up on the same side against the population? Why is it that big corporations, big government, big media, the academy all line up against the people? That seems counterintuitive. So there are two questions. One is, what is the establishment? And how does this thing work? And the second question is, why is it doing what it is doing? Or what is it trying to do? So there's this underlying thing, which you could call the establishment, you could call it the deep state, you could call it various things. But it clearly isn't what we have been told that it is. So I'm going to try to explain what the establishment is and why it is doing what it is doing. First of all, you have to understand what society is in abstract terms, not in all the level of detail that you experience it in your everyday life, but what society is in a very abstract sense. Society is a power structure. It is a system of relationships between individuals that organizes collective action. It organizes them to act together in a way that minimizes conflict and maximizes cooperation. Or at least that is the ideal. And that is the point of society. That is why we have societies. Because they allow us to work together for our mutual benefit. Regardless of the political system or the nominal political system, the social power structure will always be a hierarchy. There is no alternative to this, because a hierarchy is the only effective way to organize a large system of individuals into something that is coherent and has agency. There is no other way to organize something on a large scale. So society will always be a hierarchy. And you can think of it as a pyramid or a cone that is broad at the base and narrow at the top. It has a top and a bottom, an outside and an inside. And people generally want to be at the top and on the inside. They don't want to be at the bottom or on the margins. And, that is because those places are worse, generally speaking. If you're on the margins, then society is less about you. It caters less to your needs. If you are at the bottom, then you are supporting more layers above you. Now, that doesn't mean that you're being exploited because you're at the bottom. It just means that, that's just how things work. Everybody can't be at the top. Everybody can't be in the center. And that's the only structure that works to organize a bunch of individuals into a society. All right, so what I call the establishment is just the upper levels of the hierarchy. You could say it's the top 1% of individuals, maybe. Or you could say it's something like, it's hard to say. Like, it wouldn't be possible to define it in simple terms. But it consists of the people who hold a lot of social power within the society. And the establishment itself is a social power structure, just like the larger society that it is part of. It is the little pyramid on top of the big pyramid, and it has its own internal structure. It is obviously the top of the larger social power structure, and also the core, because it is at the center. The top is at the center, right? In a pyramid, the top is at the center. So that's what the establishment is. It is the top of the pyramid. It is what gives society coherence and agency. It holds society together and allows it to act as a unit. And in order for society to exist, the establishment must be established. It must be able to maintain its existence. And that's very important, because a lot of what the establishment does, it does simply to maintain its existence. All right. Now, how you get into the establishment is, you have to either climb up the hierarchy or be lifted up into it by others. all the power in society devolves from people, because social power is just the ability to direct the actions of others, to basically say, you do this, you do that, right? And nobody has this power intrinsically. Nobody is born with a magic thought beam that allows them to make others do things for them. So the way you get that kind of power is you get others to give it to you to act on their behalf. And you have to kind of slowly build up the base of your power. I don't want to get into the details of how people acquire social power. I'm writing a book and I have like a whole section on that. It would take me like an hour just to talk about that. But the point is that there's nothing necessarily magical about the people who occupy the establishment, except that they have managed to get into the establishment. They have managed to acquire positions of social power, one way or another. And once they are there, they do work, and they work together to maintain the power structure, to prevent it from falling apart. They do various things to try and keep themselves in those positions of power. I guess the main point is that everyone is insecure in the sense that everyone has to do things to maintain their positions in this dynamic system. Nobody is just granted power by God or by nature. You have to acquire it, and then you have to maintain it. So a lot of what these people do is done for the sake of just holding on to the power that they already have. But conversely, once people are established in positions of power, they have the power to maintain their positions. Social power is circular. Once you have it, you can use it to maintain your power or even to get more power. In fact, that's true of all kinds of power, even physical power, right? Like you have to have some physical strength to eat, to go and find food and eat. But if you have enough strength to find a surplus of food, then you have a surplus of energy and you can do more than just seek food, right? Well, social power is similar. As you acquire it, you can use it to acquire yet more social power. And so it's like money. And money is a kind of social power, but not all social power is money. All right. So the establishment is not just individuals, it is also institutions. I'll talk about that in a minute. It cannot simply plunder the society. It cannot simply plunder the levels below for the benefit of its members, because if it did that, then it would make itself vulnerable to replacement, because the lower levels would have an incentive to find a new establishment, to overthrow the existing establishment and replace it with something else. And that's called a revolution. And revolutions happen when the levels below believe that they are being exploited, and so they think that someone else can offer them a better deal. So the establishment doesn't just plunder the levels below or exploit them, generally speaking. It usually does a lot of things to benefit the levels below. But not entirely, because the establishment has its own motivations. And so it acts in its own interests as a unit, generally speaking. But it also usually cooperates with the levels below, because that is usually in its own interest. What it does is it sets up a system of incentives that operate on the levels below to maintain the existing power structure. And that's how society works. It's mostly based on incentives. The establishment provides rewards and punishments to the levels below that generally benefit the supporters of the establishment and harm the opponents of the establishment. The establishment will set up things that are generally beneficial for society, such as a law against murder, but it might selectively enforce that law in a way that benefits itself, not society as a whole. That's just an example. But that's how you maintain power. You use incentives. You incentivize people to support you by rewarding those who support you and punishing those who oppose you. And that's how the establishment works. It extracts power from the levels below, and then it uses that power to create incentives that make society work, but also that maintain the establishment in its position of power, and also benefit the elite class. So it uses the power of society to make society work, to benefit the members of society, but also to maintain its own position within society and to reward its members a little bit more. They skim a little bit off the top, right? And this is all based on the productive labor of society. Things people do. All the work that people do generates stuff, right? Whether it's goods, services, or whatever, and then that gets distributed. All right. I know that was very abstract, but I had to frame this in very abstract terms, or it won't make sense. Because you have to get beyond the delusion of things like the independent media and democracy and political parties and all that stuff to understand what is going on. Okay, so now I'm going to explain how the establishment maintains its power and how it uses left-wing ideology to justify its existence. And, you know, they do this in a very selective way, which makes sense when you understand what they're doing. In the modern West, the establishment has the following major components: government, politicians, the academy, the media, the financial system, and the big owners of capital, such as big corporations and the ultra-rich. That is the establishment in the modern West. It is not one single thing. It has many components that work together to maintain their power and to benefit an elite class. And I think people are starting to see this, right? People are starting to see that the media is not independent of the government. And it selectively promotes one politician versus another. The academy is not unbiased. It is not just seeking knowledge for the sake of knowledge. It is not an independent institution. The financial system is far from an independent institution. And big corporations and the ultra-rich are not necessarily competing with one another. Once they get to a high enough level, they are usually cooperating to create something like an oligarchy or an oligopoly, right? Where you have a small number of large corporations that are very secure, that are almost immune to competition. Okay, so people are starting to realize that, yeah, well, we sort of have capitalism, but when you get up to a higher level, it's not really capitalism, it's not really a free market. We sort of have democracy, but not really, because the media are trying to influence people to determine their decisions, and the two political parties are kind of owned by the same interests anyway. So is that really democracy? Does the academy actually seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge, or does it just seek to perpetuate itself and promote the establishment? People are starting to, see what's going on and realize, well, this theoretical model in which The government just does what it's supposed to do, works for the people. The politicians are elected democratically in a fair competition. The media are independent watchdogs. The academy is a separate class of people seeking truth. The financial industry can more or less be ignored because it's, it doesn't really matter. It's just another business. And the economy is determined by market dynamics. All of those things are a little bit naive, or a lot naive. The truth is something else. The truth is that you have big corporations, big finance, big media, big government, and the academy all kind of working together to promote their interests. And politicians are power brokers that kind of hold this coalition together and benefit from it. So that's what you really have. You have this ruling establishment structure that pretends to be something else. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ways in which the establishment maintains itself. So, for example, government spending. Government spending is a big part of maintaining the establishment because it gives the establishment power, and it can use that power to maintain itself. The establishment has to extract power from the layers below it and use that power to maintain its existence. And one way it can extract power from the levels below is with taxation. Another way it can extract power from the levels below is by creating money. Fractional reserve banking is a way to move power around, by creating money which can then be spent to make people do things, right? That's what money is. It's a kind of power. It directs the actions of others, right? All right, so you get politicians using government spending to reward supporters, who are usually big corporations or the ultra-rich, with government contracts or subsidies or whatever. So politicians are in the business of selling those services in order to get elected, right? They say, well, if you get me into power, I will use that power to benefit you. So there are all these little deals going on, right? And they also promise gives me dat to these large populations that are concentrated in certain areas to, have a power base among those people. There's a bit of a populist base there as well, which is bought with government spending. Taxation is a weapon. Taxation can be used to reward friends and punish enemies. If you have complicated tax rules, then you can offer to reward supporters by creating loopholes that they can get through and avoid taxes. You can also arbitrarily enforce tax law in some cases, but not others, to punish your opponents. So the more complicated and arbitrary the taxation system is, the more power that gives the establishment to reward its supporters and punish its opponents. Government borrowing can also be used to create incentives. It can be used as a reward for supporters in the financial industry. Government bonds are low-risk investments, right? And you can purchase government bonds with money that is created by fractional reserve banking. So the financial industry can conjure money out of thin air, use that to purchase government bonds, get interest from the bonds, and thus be rewarded. And the government then has the power to spend that money. And so it's a win-win scenario. The financial industry wins, and the government gets that power, and the politicians promise to use that power on behalf of their supporters. And so that helps to maintain the establishment, because it gives them the power to punish enemies and reward supporters. So taxing, borrowing, and spending can all be used as financial incentives to maintain the existing power structure. And that's why those things are quite large. They have grown very large in the modern West, because the powers that be are using them to maintain their positions of power. But the establishment does not justify borrowing, taxing, and spending as a way to maintain its existence, right? And this is where persuasion comes in. You can't just have incentives. Generally speaking, society is held together by more than just incentives. It is also held together by persuasion, by mass delusions, by ideas that hide reality. The reality is that the establishment uses the power of taxation, borrowing, and spending to maintain its existence. But it needs some other justification for those things. And that's where leftist ideology is useful. Leftist ideology is not used to promote the redistribution of concentrated wealth. Instead, it is used to promote a big government, big business, big finance coalition that is brokered by politicians. The various welfare schemes are funded by borrowing from the financial industry. The money that is spent eventually flows into the pockets of the big owners of capital. It flows toward big corporations and the ultra-rich. And so the expansion of the welfare state has not decreased the disparities of wealth in the West. It has increased them. But of course, it is justified with leftist ideology as necessary to rectify injustices of nature or history or society. Like, we must borrow and spend this money because if we don't, these poor children won't get lunches, or they won't have good schools, or, the black people. Look at the black people in the U.S. living in the ghettos, how horrible this is. We must spend more money to help lift them out of this condition. But of course, it doesn't have that effect. So that's an example of how the establishment uses left-wing ideology to justify something that is really for its own sake. Now, what about the academy and the media? How do they play into this? Well, consider the media. There are a small number of big media companies, right? And even though things are shifting away from old media, they still have a lot of influence. They still have a lot of persuasive power, right? They can manipulate the minds of the masses. And that is the job of the media. The job of the media is to control the minds of the masses with entertainment and persuasion. And the reason why the media do that is because they are big corporations and they are owned by the ultra-rich, so they tend to act in the interests of their owners, and they are part of that established system. Like, once you become a big company, even, whether it's Google or MSNBC or whatever, you have a vested interest in maintaining things the way they are, because you're a winner in that system. You have an interest in preventing new companies from rising up and challenging you, right? You want to keep your competitors down. And that's why big corporations and big ultra-rich people are often somewhat leftist, at least, in terms of, let's have higher rates of income tax, because this gives them a way to virtue signal, and it doesn't really hurt them. They don't even need income to maintain their positions, because they're already at the top, right? They don't need to get richer. But some little company that makes $1 million a year maybe and is trying to expand is going to be crippled by high taxes and by complex regulations. It's not going to be able to climb up that hierarchy of wealth in the market, right? So the only way that little company is going to be able to succeed is to be bought by another company, right? By one of the big companies. So you end up with this system in which the big companies promote the governments that are fairly left-leaning economically, because it actually benefits them to be in a less free market economy. And again, this is very selective. They're very pro-free trade in the sense of they want to open markets. And they're very pro bring in cheap workers, right? They like those things. They like that kind of free market, so-called free market. But low taxes, no, that would be bad, right? So again, you want to justify these things. What's the best way to justify them? Well, use leftist ideology. Most people find leftist ideology very compelling, and it fits right into Christianity. It fits into this post-Christian value system where, supposedly we're being nice to other people, we're doing things for the sake of others, we're helping out the poor and the downtrodden, blah, blah, blah. But the real motivation for these policies is to benefit the establishment, to benefit the big corporations, the ultra-rich, to maintain their positions of power. And the academy is in a similar kind of position to the media, but it's a little bit different. It is funded differently. The academy is funded by government grants, private donations, and tuition, basically, right? And so government grants are based on bureaucratic considerations. You write up some grant proposal and a bunch of people read it and blah, blah, blah. It's a very circular thing. So is publication, by the way. I can't stand these people who think that peer review is some kind of magical thing that makes that just generates the truth. That peer review is an unbiased way of evaluating research. It's a fucking joke. The academy is a fucking joke. It's sad, but that's the truth. Just like the media, right? I mean, you must by now realize that the media is a fucking joke. Well, anyway, to go back to the academy, it is funded by government, so it's got a close connection to government, right? It's got a connection to all these government institutions and the people who hold power within them. Of course, those people had to come through the academy to get there, right? So this creates all kinds of personal relationships and backroom deals and stuff, implicit or explicit. Private donations from the ultra-rich, a lot of it. Big corporations, mega-rich people. And then there's the students. Well, either the students come from upper-class backgrounds, in which case they're close to the establishment to begin with, or they're using government-backed student loans. And that's probably money created by the financial industry, kind of, a little bit of a plundering of the economy, and transferred to students for them to transfer to the academy. So the academy gets its juice in those ways, right? It gets its juice by virtue of the establishment, not by virtue of being a source of knowledge, but it gets its money from those sources that are biased, that have a clear interests in maintaining a certain kind of system. The academy is a training ground for establishment lackeys, right? For people who carry out the directives of the establishment, who push around symbols and translate the directives from above into directives at a lower level. So of course it preaches the religion of the establishment. See, every society needs a myth that holds it together because people don't understand what society is. It's just like people don't understand what marriage is. So they need this this ritual with all of its symbolism and stuff, and a big party and all that crap, even though that has absolutely nothing to do with the real functional purpose of marriage. It's just packaging, right? And the same thing is true of the myth, that society is there to help everybody overcome various inequities and injustices, etc. That's just packaging. It's not what society is actually doing. But people need that packaging because they can't understand the world as it really is. All right, so let me just give an example of how the academy is distorted by the incentives that are placed on it. And it doesn't even have to be conscious. People don't even have to be fully conscious of what they're doing. Let's just take, for example, Keynesian economics. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to read the seminal work in this, the general theory of interest, money, and something. I have that book sitting somewhere. It's the biggest pile of gibberish you'll ever have to try to comprehend. It's just nonsense. It makes no sense whatsoever. And Keynesian economics has no logical foundation. It has no explanatory or predictive power. It is just a game that is played with words and numbers, and that's it. It is useless as a guide to action. It does not have any practical use in determining what would be good economic policy. None. But it does have a use as a justification for government borrowing and spending. It's useful as a smokescreen that you can throw over that and say, well, we need to do this because, and here's a bunch of numbers, and here's a bunch of gibberish, and there you go. Refute that, right? And the other thing it does is it provides a justification for the employment of economists. The alternative view, the Austrian view, pretty much says that you don't really need economists. You just need to have the free market with, certain things provided by the state. Oh, there are these extreme anarchist people, but regardless of those debates, I don't want to get into that. Let's take the Hayekian view. Okay, the Hayekian view is, well, you need the government, but then most of these things are better done by the market, and that's it. And you really don't need a whole team of economists working at a central bank or working in some agency trying to figure out what to do or determine policy. And there really isn't much to study either. There really isn't much need for an economics profession because what are you studying? Most of the things that Keynesian economics deals with are aggregate monetary variables, which can be logically shown to have no meaning. There's no meaning to something like GDP. That's one of the funny things, right? The news media always talks about this stuff. The economists love to talk about these things. But you can prove, logically, that they are meaningless. But you see, that view would imply that you don't need economists. Whereas the Keynesian view, which is really complicated, and you have all these equations and models and things, and you take these aggregate variables and you plug them in, and some guy comes up with this number, another guy comes up with this number. Now you need a whole army of economists, right? Well, which of these two views is going to win? The one that is true, or the one that justifies the employment of economists, their role in the government, and the existence of the central bank and all of its game-playing decisions, the manipulation of interest rates, government spending, right? The winner is going to be the one that justifies what the establishment wants to do and also justifies the existence of economists. That's what economists are going to find more compelling. Something that justifies their own existence and gives them a job, right? So that even if people weren't really conscious of what they were doing, over time, Keynesian economics was pretty much guaranteed to win and become the establishment view because it is more useful to the establishment. Okay, so that's an example of how these things work. The academy is very biased because there are incentives acting on it. And the players of the game within that system have to play it to win. If they don't play it to win, they lose and they're out of the system. Okay, what role do politicians play in the establishment? Well, politicians are power brokers. They are deal makers. They are also, to some extent, marketers, right? They market to the masses. But they are fairly opportunistic about ideologies. The best politicians are the ones that have no ideology that they are deeply committed to, but choose ideologies or ideological viewpoints on an ad hoc basis, depending on how well they work, to justify what they want to do. And that's why, although there might appear to be big ideological differences between political parties, that is mostly just for the sake of appearance. That is just rhetoric, right? You'll have one party that appeals to the religious right, another that appeals to the collectivist left or whatever, but it doesn't really matter. They're just using those ideologies to get consent, to persuade the masses to support them. What they will actually do when they get into power is they will work for the benefit of the establishment and to maintain the existing power structure. So it doesn't really matter who gets elected. That's one of the sad truths about democracy. What matters is, what are the incentives acting on the people who are elected? And if those incentives are the same, they will do pretty much the same thing. Was there a big difference between Bush and Obama? Was there a big difference between George W. Bush and Obama? Not that I could see. There was a big difference in their styles, a big difference in the way they appealed to the masses. But in terms of their actual actions in office, I don't see a big difference. And, I'm sure that you guys understand that the big corporations funnel money to politicians in lots of different ways. So do the ultra-rich. So do foreign powers, right? Like, to what extent is the establishment in the U.S. even governed by United States citizens? And to what extent is it manipulated by foreign powers? And you might think this is a case for nationalism, but it actually isn't. Because you're going to have that problem no matter what. A little tiny nation can have its elites bought off. That happens all the time to these little countries, little African or Central American countries. Their leadership, their establishment gets bought by foreign powers and becomes an instrument of the foreign power to some extent. But again, it's always limited, right? Because they can't completely piss off their populations, or the populations will revolt. So the power structure is maintained by this balance between competing interests. But anyway, so there are all these financial feedback loops, between political power and financial power. So that's how the establishment works. The modern welfare state, with high government spending, a complicated tax system, ever-growing government debt, and a fractional reserve banking system, is an effective mechanism for maintaining a coalition of interests in power. Large corporations and rich individuals selectively funnel money to politicians. Politicians make policies and laws that selectively reward or punish corporations and individuals. The feedback loop between financial power and political power helps to maintain both. It keeps the corporations from losing their positions of power in the economy, and it keeps the politicians in power in the government. The media controls the minds of the masses, and the academy creates the educated intellectual class that supports the establishment and promotes the existing system. And in turn, this class of, quote-unquote educated intellectuals are supported by the establishment. They get jobs within it, they get nice little pensions, they get nice little titles, and they get to feel really good about themselves for doing what they do, which is preaching a religion to the masses and helping to perpetuate the existing power structure. So that's the establishment. It is a self-perpetuating power structure that benefits an elite class, but is also a necessary evil in a sense. It is necessary to make society work. You have to have an establishment of some kind. You can choose between one or another, but you can never have no establishment. Now, why does the establishment support mass immigration and the demographic replacement of whites in Europe and the US? Well, mainly this is about benefiting the owners of big capital. Capital earns profits from its use. If you have an apartment building, you rent out the units to people, and you have to spend a certain amount on maintenance and operations, and then the rest is profit, right? So the whole point of capital is to make a profit. A factory earns profits because it makes the labor of workers more efficient. So the workers are willing to go to work in the factory, they get paid a wage, and the owners of the factory can take a profit from the operation, assuming that they make it work, they make it profitable, right? And this is not a scam, this is not a trick, this is not exploitation. The factory benefits both the worker and the owner because it makes the process of production more efficient. It increases the actual physical profits on labor, okay? And so the owner and the workers kind of split the difference. The same thing with an apartment. Building an apartment building takes energy, it takes work to do, and renting it to people benefits the people who want to live there. They get a place to live. The owner makes a profit on the renter gets a place to live, they both benefit. So capitalism is not exploitation. Capital has value. It has utility. So it is perfectly reasonable that the owners of capital make profits. And also, if you're allowed to keep the profits from owning capital, that provides an incentive to create new capital. So capitalism works. It's not a scam, it's not exploitation, it is a good system. It's very beneficial. However, there are some things about capitalism that create certain problems. One of them is that in the long run, the net profit on capital tends toward zero in a free market because you get competition. If there's a profit to be made, people compete to make that profit, and that drives down the profit toward zero. There's another problem that has to do with fractional reserve banking specifically, which is that in this kind of system that we have throughout the West, capital creation can be funded by borrowing money that may not be paid back necessarily. So you're conjuring money out of thin air and extracting productive work from the economy to build capital when you borrow from that system to do something like that, but you might not be able to pay back that investment. Now, if all investments pay back, then fractional reserve banking sort of works. I'm not saying it's like the worst possible system, but it has certain problems. It has a kind of hidden subsidy to investors and speculators that they can borrow money, use it to create capital, try to get a profit from it, but if they fail, they can declare bankruptcy. And in that case, the cost of building the capital was subsidized by the entire economy, in a sense. And so that can lead to an accumulation of excess capital or bad investment. Now, another thing is going on to complicate the picture, which is that we are pulling an enormous amount of energy out of the earth and using that to do almost everything. Like almost everything that you see around you in a human-created environment was created with energy from fossil fuels. It was like a road was built with energy from fossil fuels powering the machinery. The walls of a house were, even if they're made out of wood, the wood was cut with a chainsaw. It was driven from the mountain where it was cut or whatever with a truck. It was cut in a sawmill additionally. It was then, put through some industrial processing and transported to the house. And then the guys who put it together might have been using nail guns and, tons of energy flowing into our economy from the earth. And the effects of all of these things together is that we have produced a lot of capital. Around the world, there has been a huge accumulation of capital. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. This is a good thing because capital improves the efficiency of labor. Okay. Now, I do think that we are wasting a lot of the energy we pull out of the earth, but that's another issue. But this accumulation of capital creates a problem for the owners of capital. It drives down profits. And the big owners of capital want capital to be as profitable as possible. And that's true for the small owners as well, but not as much because, because they're more affected by other things. Like, for example, I'll just use an example. Let's say you own a house. You might be happy to see the price of houses double because then you're like, hey, I have this $1 million house now, and I only paid $500,000 for it. And, the mortgage I have left to pay off is nothing. I could sell the house and have a huge profit. So a small owner of capital, like a house owner, might think that that's a big windfall. However, he might also think, well, but then my kids won't be able to afford houses, right? But to somebody who owns factories and apartment buildings and mansions and stuff like that, his kids are set. So it doesn't really matter, right? So there's a difference between the small owners of capital, small business, and the large owners of capital. They really want prices to increase, especially when they built the capital using borrowed money, because they have to pay interest on their loans, and they want to make a profit from those investments so they can pay off the loans and take a profit, right? Not declare bankruptcy. So it's really important for the big owners of capital that the return on capital does not tend toward zero. They really like asset price inflation, even though in terms of the efficiency of the economy as a whole, you want the return on capital to tend toward zero. So the way that we have tried to, in the modern West, deal with this dilemma of capitalism is infinite growth, always growing and growing and growing, right? Always getting bigger, a giant pyramid scheme. We want the prices of everything to go up. We want capital to become more profitable, but we also want to kind of raise everybody's living standard while we're doing that. And the way we maintain that is by pulling more and more energy out of the earth, and also by growing the population. And that's really important, right? So these guys, the big owners of capital, are terrified at the prospect of a couple of things. One is a reduction in consumption. Another is a rise in wages, but that's less of a concern than a reduction in consumption. And another is a fall in asset prices generally. So they're really afraid of those things, because if any of those things happen, their investments fail. And their capital becomes less valuable, and usually because it's being floated along on loans, they won't be able to pay off the loans. And if the loans can't be paid off, the financial industry basically has to declare bankruptcy as well, right? So if the big capital owners declare bankruptcy, the financial industry declares bankruptcy, the whole system comes crashing down. And they really don't want that to happen. They're very afraid of that happening. So that explains why the government does various things that benefit the big owners of capital. And here are some of the things that the government does to maintain the profitability of capital in the modern West. Increasing demand for things like rents, housing, consumer products, with government spending and immigration. Keeping interest rates low so that the loans can be rolled over, just floated on indefinitely. And the way the government does that is by selling lots of its own bonds. That's what the Federal Reserve does to manipulate interest rates. It buys government bonds. Well, the government bonds have to be sold. The government has to borrow money, essentially, for the Federal Reserve to buy those bonds, or for the Chinese government to buy it, or whatever. So that finances the government spending, which increases the profits on capital. The owners of capital want to increase the scale at which their capital is employed. If you have a factory, you want to sell to as many people as possible, right? Because then you can get more profit from the capital by using it on a larger scale. So trade agreements, right? And also bring in cheap labor and new consumers, new renters, new house buyers, etc. The government also limits the supply of capital by creating complicated regulations that give large established companies an advantage over smaller, younger competitors. So like a little up-and-coming business is going to have a really hard time competing against a large corporation, because the large corporation has lawyers and accountants and lobbyists and all these things that give it an advantage. The government, I said already, it imports foreign workers to keep wages low and rents high. It has been encouraging women to go into the workforce instead of raising families, with the superficial justification that this is for their own self-actualization. It's like it's convinced women that yoga plus a corporate cubicle job is like fucking nirvana, rather than staying home and baking muffins and raising kids and helping out at the school. Not just the government, the academy, the media, the government, the whole system, the establishment has pushed women into the workforce. And by doing that, that keeps wages lower. It also creates more demand for a lot of consumer goods. Now it reduces demand, though, for the goods related to children, right? So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, but if you bring in immigrants to replace children, then you can keep the system going, right? So all of these things are ways of trying to, increase the rents on capital or the return on investment. And finally, the government can fight wars to open new markets, to change the global power structure to benefit its own members, essentially. Also to obtain resources, especially that magical energy that comes out of the ground, that we are just flooding into our economies. To eliminate competitors, economic competitors as well, right? And also to distribute wealth to cronies. Not only do wars kind of reward the military for its existence, they give generals and admirals and colonels jobs and titles and money. It creates this force that you can use around the world to impose your will on the world. There are all these military contracts, which you can then justify as necessary because we have to fight the Great Holy War to save the world from Saddam Hussein or Assad or somebody. Or Russia, Putin, whatever. So all of these things benefit the owners of big capital at the expense of the existing population and the smaller people, the people in the levels below. And people are starting to wake up to this fact, but they're basically pacified by a combination of things. They're pacified by leftist ideology, which is a kind of religion, which fits very well into the existing post-Christian moral intuitions of the masses. Like, we have been raised in this post-Christian Christianity of, lovey-dovey, sing imagine, as long as we all care about each other, the world will be a wonderful place. So that pacifies people because they get to believe that they're being good without having to really do anything. So they get a little moral, psychological reward. They get cheap consumer goods. They get all kinds of entertainment. They are liberated from biology, right? They're liberated from their biological purpose of having children. And they get their lattes and their yoga and their sushi. And, life is not bad in that way. It works. This can work for a little while. It just doesn't last forever. It isn't going to work forever. Because it destroys the capital on which it depends. It destroys the biological capital, the people. And it destroys the physical capital, the energy. So the current system is feeding on these two kinds of capital. It's using them up. And it's building up instead this fairly large amount of industrial capital, buildings, infrastructure, factories, computers, power stations, etc. Anyway, so I know this was kind of rambling and it was kind of long, but I wanted to talk about this because it is very important to understand the way things are working in the modern world. There is the facade of what society is and how it works, and then there is the reality. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Hopefully this made some kind of sense, and if you made it this far, thanks for listening.